If you've been listening to the news lately, and since there are not a lot of undergrads at this Mass, I assume that you have. You recently heard the story of Newt Gingrich. As you know, during the presidency of Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton was unfaithful to his wife, Newt Gingrich went after him with a vengeance for his infidelity and went off on how awful that was for the country and how evil this is to have this kind of example in leadership. 2 weeks ago, he admitted that even as he was going off on the president, he himself was having an affair at the very same time. A couple of months earlier, a pastor from one of those mega churches in Colorado Springs, who railed against homosexuality many times, Sunday after Sunday, who lobbied against gay rights, who himself had a wife and children, admitted to having an affair with a gay prostitute. Even as he was going off on homosexuals, even as he was going off on denying them rights, he himself, a married man, was having an affair with a man. I remember back maybe 20 years now, probably a little less, the head prosecuting attorney for the city of St. Louis, his name was George Peach. If you're from St. Louis, you might remember that. He spent a lot of his time in leadership in the city going after porn shops, porn houses, and prostitutes, reining them in, prosecuting them, putting them in jail, these women. And this husband and this father of 5 beautiful daughters finally was caught having an affair himself, ongoing, with one of those prostitutes. Kind of makes me worry about what you hear me rail against. Morality. Morality is not about rules, and it's not about regulations. Morality is about self-knowledge. Morality in each of our lives is achieved only by an inner confrontation. Morality happens when we are willing to confront the person within. And if we fail to confront the person in us, if that shadow in us is avoided, it gets projected out there on somebody or everybody else. And it's something we've gotten very good at. If you put it out there, if you rail against it out there, then you don't have to deal with it in here, in ourselves. The gospel story you just heard proclaimed is a story of a prostitute caught in the act of having adultery. And the chief priests and elders, the leaders, went after her, and they went after her with a vengeance. This story unmasks for us ourselves to ourselves. It unmasks for us this common, all too common experience that you and I are guilty of as well. That if we project our sin out there, if we project our darkness out there and our guilt and our shadow, we'll literally be throwing our stuff. Literally, they were throwing their stuff at her. At her. And that way they didn't have to look at it in themselves. By condemning her, they were off the hook. They didn't have to admit it was true of them in one way or another, at least in some way along that continuum that is always everybody's sin. They didn't have to admit it at all to anybody, including themselves. And the truth was, they were guilty too. And so as this rage is building up in them, this anger building up in them towards this woman, all Jesus does is bend over and start doodling on the ground. And in that doodling, he gave him a second, he gave him a pause that we all need when the rage is building up in us and we start to go off on somebody else. He gave him a pause. He made him take a breath as he doodled on the ground in the sand of that desert. They had time, they had a second, a pause button. And all he said was, "How are you like her? How are you like her?" If you're not also guilty of unfaithfulness somewhere in your life, then go ahead, throw the stone. You can be the first. And then he went back to doodling on the ground. They dropped the stone that was in their hands. In that moment of grace, they realized that they were as guilty, perhaps in different ways, but truly, as she was. And they went home. And I imagine that day they had a lot to think about that they had never let themselves think about before. They let go of that self-righteous tirade. They let go of that finger pointing and decided to not throw it out there at her this time. And so they dropped the stone and went home. If something is welling up within us, the best thing we can do is step back. If we find ourselves starting to get enraged about something in another person, even our spouses or our children, much less our leaders in church or in state, then maybe the first thing we need to do is take a breath, hit the pause button, stop for just a second, step back, and instead of looking out there, instead of being so ready to throw our garbage out there on them, maybe the best thing we can do for just a second is look within first, look inward first, and be aware of how true it is for me too, and others. I don't know that I have any great credentials to read American culture, but it seems to me that we're getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And as I look at the church, it doesn't seem to me that we're very much different from that. That it just seems like people are mad, they're angry. And I'd like to propose to you, standing on this gospel story this morning, that maybe we're so mad because we've not done our own work yet. And maybe the reason we're so crazy about throwing that anger out on somebody else, even if what they're doing is wrong, it's because we've failed to do the work that is ours to do, to challenge it in ourselves first. We got some work to do, you and I. Not just on this Sabbath when we're aware of it because of this gospel story, not just during Lent because we're a little hyper-conscious of these dark sides of our own nature, but I'm talking about the rest of our lives. This is a work that is ours to do to the day we die, to the day we take our last breath. To not throw it out there, but look at it in here first. We got some work to do, and it'll never be done. And the work is to recognize that there's a continuum in every sin, and all of us are on that continuum somewhere. There's an old saying that we hate in others what we hate in ourselves. And as I look at this world, that seems to be more true than ever. I'm not saying we shouldn't challenge each other. We need to challenge each other. I need your voice to help me become free, even if you're not free yet all the way yourself. You know, a mother who smokes can tell her daughter, invite her daughter to not smoke, albeit probably a less successful challenge. But nevertheless, she knows what it's like to be a prisoner of an addiction. And maybe she can say it better than anybody. She doesn't have to have it all together before she asks her daughter not to smoke. She needs to say those things. But if she sees the cigarette in her own hands, she's going to do it a whole lot more gently and a whole lot more humbly, because she's in it with her too. I think we'd be in a different America if we knew that deeper than we know anything. We'd be in a very different church if we knew that different than we know anything. I am not a preacher who practices what he preaches. I am preaching to myself every single Sunday because I need to hear it too. If we take a look at ourselves first, if we recognize that shadow in us, if we take the time to do this inner confrontation to this person within us, even as we speak to each other, it's going to affect everything. And the nation will be the better for it. And the church will be the better for it. And the relationship of nation to nation will be the better for it. This Sunday, I invite you to drop the stone, to take a breath next time you see the anger coming up in you and you start to go off on somebody or something else, to take a breath and to drop the stone and go home and think about your life. And I promise you, I will try to do the same myself.